Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our discussions of the complete poems of the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass. We turn now to Song of Myself, passage number 20. Now, there is, I think, a really important moment here that we want to identify. And if you've been with me through all of the previous discussions, that is to say at learnstrong.net, find that playlist down the left-hand side there that's quickly growing. We have worked with all of the 24 poems of inscriptions, the 19 sections of starting from Paumanok, and the 19 sections of Song of Myself. So in other words, we've worked with as many sections in Song of Myself as we're in starting from Paumanok. And you'll remember that I said that we use all of our work for the inscriptions 24 poems as well as the 19 sections of Paumanok to get ready to read Song of Myself. And you'll remember that I said that there's a certain kind of echoing that happens that makes us think as well about T.S. Eliot's Burnt Norton's lines at the opening of that, and we're going to finish actually this discussion with T.S. Eliot's Burnt Norton. That is to say, my words echo thus in your mind, but to what purpose I do not know, disturbing the dust on a bowl of rose leaves. I think Eliot was heavily influenced by this idea that there's certain kinds of notes, I'll use the musical terminology, that seem to keep coming back again and again. Now it's at this point with passage 20 that many scholars will see a shift and a passage 20 through 25 kind of section, where in some ways we're going to now meet the poet, Walt Whitman. You remember that we talked about those 5 in that intro lecture, I hope you've watched that, where we're going to see now Walt Whitman the poet, and more particularly this kind of almost like mystical type of enlightenment that will happen through first of an awakening and then finally a certain kind of purifying, and to some degree this purification is going to involve the acceptance of the body, of the physical, which will make it so radical. Now remember, I said that I think the key to reading Song of Myself is that line from passage 4, both in and out of the game and watching and wondering at it. And then he finishes that little passage by saying, I witness and wait. Now, I think that's a pivotal line. Whitman wrote in his notes, I stand for the sunny point of view. I would write that line down, and then I would just use it as a way to think about his optimism. The great scholar Ed Folsom has pointed out that when you look at the notebook of Whitman, you can almost find the genesis for Leaves of Grass. He writes in his notebooks this: do not descend in among professors and capitalists. And then there's 2 blank pages. And then he writes, I am the poet of slaves and of the masters of slaves. I'm the poet of the body, and I am. And then he stops. And in many ways, this is the I of Leaves of Grass, and more particularly, of course, of Song of Myself. He crosses out those lines, and then there's a little space, and then he writes, I am the poet of the body, and I'm the poet of the soul. We're going to hear these lines absolutely echoed in passage 48 of Song of Myself, but we're going to hear it even in passage 20, which is why I'm setting it up for it. He says, I go with the slaves of the earth equally with the masters, and I will stand between the slaves and the masters. And in many ways, this is the beginning, then, you could argue, of Leaves of Grass and Song of Myself. Now, I think that's a powerful argument from the notebooks itself. When we look at passage 20, we definitely see a shift here. Before, there's a certain kind of introduction to Song of Myself. I think by passage 20, we're ready to meet Walt Whitman in all of his complexity. And this poet Whitman, and again, there's so many Whitmans, but this poet Whitman is compelling. Now, because this is a longer passage, we're going to have to spend some time with it, but I think this one deserves to be read in its entirety before we actually exegete. So let's go ahead now and just read through the passage and enjoy that experience. Who goes there, hankering, gross, mystical, nude? How is it I extract strength from the beef I eat? What is a man anyhow? What am I? What are you? All I mark as my own, you shall offset with your own, else it were time lost listening to me. I do not snivel the world over, that months are vacuums of the ground but wallow in filth, whimpering and truckling fold with powders for invalids. Conformity goes to the fourth removed. I wear my hat as I please, indoors or out. Why should I pray? Why should I venerate and be ceremonious? Having pried through the strata, analyzed to a hair, counseled with doctors and calculated close, I find no sweeter fat than sticks to my own bones. In all people I see myself, none more and not one a barleycorn less, and the good or bad I say of myself, I say of them. I know I am solid and sound. To me, the converging objects of the universe perpetually flow. All are written to me, and I must get what the writing means. I know I'm deathless. I know this orbit of mine cannot be swept by a carpenter's compass. I know I shall not pass like a child's curlicue cut with a burnt stick at night. I know I am a gust. I do not trouble my spirit to vindicate itself or be understood. I see that the elementary laws never apologize. I reckon I behave no prouder than the level I plant my house by, after all. I exist as I am. That is enough. And if no other in the world be aware, I sit content. And if each and all be aware, I sit content. One world is aware, and by far the largest to me, and that is myself. And whether I come to my own today or in 10,000 or 10 million years, I can cheerfully take it now, or with equal cheerfulness, I can wait. My foothold is tenyon and mortised in granted. I laugh at what you call dissolution, and I know the amplitude of time. Now, the confidence with which Whitman will begin, or end his poem here in terms of I know, and notice all these repetitions of I know, the anaphora as we've talked about it. And of course we're going to see and hear resonances from this I know from so many. I mean, just go back, and I hope you're doing this, where you're annotating your own copy of the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass, and just go back and start thumbing through how many times he seems to speculate epistemologically on the certainties, the things that he knows. But notice, he begins not with affirmation, but rather with these rhetorical questions. We've, of course, seen this. By the way, in the 1855 edition, he will finish this first line with a question mark. Notice it begins with, who goes there? Now, we have to smile because this is the opening line of what text? Of course, Shakespeare's Hamlet. Who's there? Nay, answer me. Stand and unfold yourself. And of course, we talk in our lectures at learnstrong.net on Hamlet, the significance of why that's such an important kind of line. Why? Because all the way through the play, Hamlet is not actually Hamlet. Hamlet is a multiplicity of Hamlets, a multiplicity of selves, and I think Whitman learned a lot from his study of Shakespeare's Hamlet. He loved to quote the play Hamlet, and I think he learned a lot about these different kinds of personages and people. So here he's ready to answer the question, who am I? Of course, this is the ontological question of our Big Five. So notice we are into the first two lines of passage 20, and we're already dealing with the first of our two Big Five, first two of our Big Five. That is to say, epistemology, what can you know? Ontology, who are you? He says, who goes there? And then he says about himself, notice four things. Hankering, it's that notion of curious. There's so many different ways to try to capture what Walt Whitman is as poet, and one of those is he's just curious. He always wants to know. Gross, that's an interesting word. It can be disgusting. It can also mean weighty, as in of the body. Mystical, I think, is central, and many have read in the next 5 sections as being about the mystical awakening of a poet. And then the word nude, and it's fascinating he would use this word. Of course, we've heard this word already in Song of Myself a couple of times, or referencing to it. I'm not ashamed, he says, of the body, and to that degree, why do I care if I'm nude? In other words, it's almost as if he's rewriting the Genesis 3 account, where when Adam and Eve have eaten of the fruit of the forbidden tree, that is to say, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they're ashamed in their nudeness. And here, notice, he will just come right out and say it. Notice he asks, to finish this question, how is it I extract strength from the beef I eat? He will say later on in passage 48, to show a beat in his pod confounds the learning of all time. So notice there's these questions, this series of kind of thoughtful questions that seem to address the idea of shame from the Genesis 2 and 3 account, right? Genesis 2:25 marries to the Genesis 3:7 passage. We've already spoken about that in our lectures on Milton's Paradise Lost. The idea that the human body is so remarkable. So, for example, we can exact strength from the beef I eat. This is, of course, going to take us back to Hamlet as well, and his musings on death. Not only dumb cattle in the soliloquy of Act 4, but you'll remember that his comments about how we can get through the progress through the guts of a beggar if you go fishing with a worm that hath ate of a king and all of that. And then he asks the very Hamlet-like question. In fact, if you want to really read this passage well, I think you got to go back and read Hamlet and remind yourself of those soliloquies, because in every one of those soliloquies, he is asking the fundamental question, what is a man anyhow? Which is, of course, the next line. What am I? What are you? Notice these rhetorical questions that will take us to the ontological question of our big five, right? That is to say, who are you anyway? All I mark, and the moment we hear this all, we're going to come back to it again a few lines later, we have to think about that whole notion of how the all, omnis, we heard it from starting from Paumanok. All I mark is my own, you shall offset it with your own. Remember, every atom belonging to me is equal belongs to you. Else it were time lost. He loves this idea of conservation of energy. Listening to me. In other words, it's a complete and total waste of your time, he says. If you spend all your time working with these poems and you don't own them at level 3B, and to use our language. In other words, the challenge is not to just read Leaves of Grass, but to own some ideas from Leaves of Grass that can in some way challenge you. And this is exactly what Whitman is saying. He says, I want you to be as challenged by the experience of Leaves of Grass as I am challenged by the experience of Leaves of Grass, and trying to come to terms with exactly who it is that I am. Then he has some interesting observations. He says, I do not snivel, right? This is that, he doesn't like weakness, right? I do not snivel the world over. By the way, this could be an answer to the theodicy question. Stop asking, why did this happen to me, and learn to ask, why did this happen for me? That's very much an understanding of the theodicy question. Why is there pain and suffering in the world for Whitman? He says, I don't snivel that months are vacuums and the ground but wallow in filth. In other words, I do not believe, he says, that life is meaningless. This will be that whole notion of, right, I stand for the sunny point of view. By the way, he often would consider this idea of the sunny point of view in diametric opposition to his own father, who did struggle with some dark pessimism, a lot of that, of course, just based economically in the struggles that were a part of that. To continue, he says, whimpering and truckling fold with powders for invalids. In other words, the doctors used to fold up the medicine, powder medicine, inside of a little paper. And in other words, he says, I'm not interested in trying to somehow cover over the challenges and the pain and suffering of life. Conformity goes to the fourth removed. In other words, it's easy once you start conforming. This will sound very much like Emerson's self-reliance essay that we've already given a full talk about. He says it's easy to start to conform, and once you start to conform, it's easy, it becomes almost generational. And then the famous line, I wear my hat as I please indoors or out. Now, I want you to go back, and I want you to take a look at the missing line that's between, that comes right before the whimpering and truckling fold. I'll let you run that down on your own. But I am interested in the 1855 edition. He didn't say I wear my hat. He said I cock my hat. Now, by the deathbed edition, he had edited the word from cock to walk, or to wear. And I like the fact that the original word was the word cock. That is to say, I cock my hat as I please, indoors or out. Now, go back to our comments on the preface of the 1855 edition, where you'll maybe remember that Whitman said in that preface, take off your hat to nothing known or unknown to any man or number of men. This idea of the hat as being a symbol, and we've said this already because we've met about hats, haven't we? Go back and just type into Google Walt Whitman and image Google this, and notice all of the photographs of Whitman where he's wearing hats. Those hats, notice how he wears them. In the front, in the center front image on the 1855 edition, when you opened the cover, was of Whitman wearing a hat, and notice how he's wearing that hat. Notice he says, I'll wear my hat any way I want. It's a symbol of what? Well, obviously the Emersonian idea of self-reliance, right? No question. And then he's going to take us back to his opening lines from passage 1 about creeds in school and abeyance. Why should I pray? Why should I venerate and be ceremonious? Now, this is the tension for Whitman. We put it in our notes already in our study from starting from Pomalock. Now we come back to it. The Eidolon's poem of Inscriptions also comes to mind. The idea that on the one hand, Whitman, very schizophrenic here, wants to celebrate the past. On the other hand, he wants to embrace the new that's coming. And as we've said, of course, the new is the new. The NEW is the KNEW. Notice here he asks, so, what's the point of praying? Why should I pray, and why should I venerate and be ceremonious? In other words, this whole idea of creeds and schools and abeyance, I'm not sure that religion is for me something that important. Remember going back to that kind of radical Quakerism that he was raised with Elias Hicks. He says, having pried through the strata, analyzed to a hair, counseled with doctors and calculated close. In other words, after all of my study and reading. Remember, Whitman is predominantly self-taught. He doesn't have much of a formal education after about the age of 11 or 12. He doesn't do any more schooling, although by 17 he himself is a school teacher or master. But he's self-taught. And he says, after all the time I spend studying, I find no sweeter fat than sticks to my own bones. A very thorough line. Go back and look at, we've done talks over all of Walden. And a line like this could come immediately out of Walden, which explains why Thoreau and Alcott decided to take their little trip after the second edition of Leaves of Grass was published to go and to meet Whitman. And where does Whitman take him? Up into his little bedroom. And Thoreau points out, it was a pretty slovenly apartment with some pretty disgusting images hanging on the wall of satyrs and the like. But it's a pure Thoreau line here, right? He says, I find no sweeter fat than sticks to my own bones. Later we're going to hear about the beautiful perfume of armpits and all of that, right? In all people, I see myself. Now this is powerful, and this is the inclusivity of Whitman. I think this is what makes Whitman so well read even still to today. What's it like to walk down the halls of our school, to walk down a city street, and to look into people's eyes and say, they are me. That's me. I could be that person. I could be living that life. And to identify in some profound way with every other person on this planet is a profound moment in terms of the way we see the world. Remember, we talk about that idea that moral development will happen first egocentric, I do what I want and that's the right thing, to ethnocentric, I do what my tribe, my group, whatever tells me to do, to finally a world-centric view that says, I'm always trying to take the other view. And remember what he said in passage 2 about filtering through yourself all of the information that's coming to you. So here he'll say it. He says, in all people I see myself, none more and not a barleycorn less, and the good or bad I say of myself, I say of them. Remember what he said in starting from Pomalock, passage 7, about there being no evil. We're back to that idea as well. In other words, I'm not going to say that there's only good in people. There's as well bad. And he says it's in me and it's in everybody else too. And then he starts with this series of epistemological statements. I know, I know, I know. He says, I know, and by the way, these are these echoes from passage 5. Go back and look at that in the epistemological position. I know I am solid and sound. He's going to root whatever he has as his mystical awakening in the body itself. To me, the converging objects of the universe perpetually flow. Now, of course, we know that he loved the new science. He loved the influence that Darwin was having. And then he comes back to the word all again. Again, starting from Pomalock, passage 7, you'll remember that word omnis, that idea of not just all, but the all. All are written to me, and I must get what the writing means. This takes us back to the idea of passage 4 with the game, both in and out of the game. I got to get what the writing means. And of course, if you'll think about it, if you are hanging with me for all these crazy lectures, these talks with Walt, one of the reasons you're doing it is the very thing he just said, to try to get to the meaning. What is the point of all of this? And to that degree, when he says, I'm hoping to get to the meaning of it, this is what we call discovery writing, as we study our Natalie Goldberg and as we play around with writing down the bones of Wild Mind. I don't write because I know what I know. I write to find out what it is that I know or what I want to know. Discovery writing. In other words, when we finish writing as poets, as writers, we often for the first time come to understandings that we didn't actually think that we could understand at all. And he says, I'm trying to get to the bottom of all of this. He says, And again, just point out the epistemological fallibilism. In other words, it's not an absolutism. It's a, I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. It's that I could be wrong that's so foundational to reading Whitman, right? He says, I know I'm deathless. Take us back, of course, to passage 6, right? To die is luckier than when one has those. I know this orbit of mine, he sees himself almost like a planet, right? Cannot be swept by a carpenter's compass. He himself was a carpenter, so was his father, right? In other words, you can't measure a human being so easily. I know I shall not pass. And then he uses this amazing simile, like a child's curlicue. By the way, this is a variant spelling of curlicue, right? Something fantastically curled, right? Flourish, we might even say in writing. A child's curlicue cut with a burnt stick at night. In other words, think of a sparkler. So you're in the nighttime, you light your sparkler and you whip it around, or children do this, right? You can see this image, you whip it around, and all of a sudden it looks like there's lines there, but they're obviously not. They don't actually exist. And he says, I know that I shall not pass. In other words, death for me, and this sounds very much like Socrates saying in Plato's Phaedo, we've given lectures on this as well, that he's very excited for the next phase of his life once death happens and he drinks his hemlock shade. He says, I know I'm not going to fade. I know there's something beyond all of this. He says, I know, and this will sound very interestingly Romanesque, I know I'm august. I do not trouble my spirit to vindicate itself or be understood. Note the irony of all of this. He says, it's like, I'm not like having a test where I have to prove or vindicate myself, and I'm not going to trouble my spirit with trying to be understood by every single person. Other parts of Leaves of Grass, he will, of course, echo the idea that he wants to be understood and accepted. So notice, there's so many permeations on the way Whitman sees himself. I see, notice we're back to sight again, perspicacity, as we said in our lectures on Plato's Republic, especially Book 7. I see that the elementary laws never apologize, defiance, right? And then in parentheses, though not there in the 55 edition, I reckon I behave no prouder than the level I plant my house by after all. I mean, this is a true thorough Walden line, no question.